and welcome to Legally Speaking with me, Tarun Nangia. Today is a very special show. It is a show to celebrate the life and times of senior advocate Iqbal Chagla, an eminent jurist whom we lost recently. Of course, we all know he was also the son of Justice M.C. Chagla, who was the Chief Justice of Bombay High Court. We lost him at the age of 85, which is a good ripe old age, but not old enough by today's standards. That we have lawyers who are 94 years old arguing in court on a day-to-day basis. So we wish he could have lived longer, but he lived up to an age of 85, which is good enough. There are many good memories surrounding him and his travels. He appeared across India in many courts, not just the Bombay High Court. At a time when the Bombay High Court was the commercial center, a lot of commercial litigation used to happen in Bombay those days. But I'm not to do the talking. We have three eminent guests who will speak, who knew him personally, who will speak about the life and times of senior advocate Iqbal Chagla. May I welcome senior advocate Darius Khambata. Good to see you. He joins us from the city of Mumbai. Hi. We have with us Mr. Ryan Karanjawala, managing partner of Karanjawala and Company, one of India's leading law firms at the Supreme Court. Good to see you, Mr. Karanjawala. And we have with us senior advocate Amit Desai, who also joins us from Mumbai. Amidst his busy schedule, he's made time. Thank you so much for joining us, and looking forward to some interesting insights from you as well. At the outset, let me request Mr. Darius Khambata to give the opening comment, and then we move on. Over to you.
Hi, Tarun. When you said give the opening comment, I really don't know how to structure this. It's very difficult for me to give you a short capsule bite about Iqbal, or Mickey, as we always knew him as. What can I say? I mean, I formally joined him in 1984, but just for a month, and then I came back after my LLM and started work with him in right earnest in middle of 1985. And I joined him in the old chambers, which was a classic old school. It was like a Dickens spectre of various counsels sitting at various tables, all in a very dark room, cluttered with briefs, papers, books all over the place, hardly any place to sit, no storage. And he had a smallish table, and we worked like that for 2 years. And then, of course, he moved into his own chambers when that whole structure of chambers was disbanded. But I think that really personified him. He came from that old school English barrister's chambers world, and he remained like that. And I can say so many things. I don't want to get into sort of an anecdotal recount. But if trying to take a step back, I think there are two broad things that marked his conduct. One is that he was a very well-rounded personality. It was not only the law for him. At any point of time, he had a series of other things going. In the old days, particularly, he was an avid photographer, and black and white photography was his passion. I've got pictures he's taken of us as children. One classic one at Juhu Beach, where he made us pose with brushwood and things like that. He was a great friend of my parents. That's why it happened. And then, of course, art, music. He loved jazz. Jazz was his absolute passion. Just living well, good food. He appreciated the finer things in life. He was an avid golfer. That, I think, also helped him being a better lawyer. Now, if you ask me what's the connection, I can't give you a direct correlation. But I think a well-rounded personality makes for a better lawyer, particularly the more senior you are and the higher you get. You really have to draw a lot of experience into the law and your argument. And I think his personality helped him in that. So that was one aspect. And the second aspect, which of course is much better known, is adherence to principles. Now, this was not only a public adherence and taking courageous stands like he did as the president of the Bar Association when we passed resolutions against 6 judges in the early 90s in Bombay. It was a principled life. So you tended to see a lot of that even in his day-to-day affairs. He would constantly be struggling with some decision. Should I do this? Should I do that? No, it wouldn't be right. I shouldn't do this. So there was a lot of that which we saw. and you then learned by example and by osmosis from him. He was, in that sense, a great teacher. He never actually sat you down and taught you anything, but you just picked it up. So, broadly speaking, I think these are the two features which, for me, really marked him as a man.
Thank you for that opening comment. We'll go to Mr. Ryan Karanjawala for his opening comment on senior advocate Iqbal Chagla. When you studied in Bombay, Mr. Karanjawala, did you happen to know him those days or no? He was too young then.
So I'll tell you, I didn't happen to know him in those days personally. But when I was, I think, in my third year of college, I had a friend who was working in Little and Company. And there was one case at that time that was being talked about all the time, which was a case called Trishaw, where one of the partners of Little and Company, Charles Grundy, was made to get into the witness box. And Iqbal was his lawyer. Mickey, as we call it, was his lawyer. And I think in those days, people felt that that was the one case that brought Mickey towards the top of not absolutely the top because he was a youngster still, but towards the top of his profession. This was somewhere in the year 78, 79. And out of the panel here, I know Mickey, I interacted with Mickey the least because, he was Bombay based, I was Delhi based, and I had occasion only to brief him in one big matter where we were appearing for Modiluf, where we were appearing for Lufthansa against Modiluf. So that was one big matter in which I briefed him. But from a distance, if I were to look back on Mickey, I would say that in my view, he's probably the last of the Mohicans. Because Mickey belonged to a generation of counsel, the likes of which I don't think we are ever likely to see again. Darius will tell you much more than I can, how smooth he was in the way he presented his case. And the important thing was also that he wore his success and his learning very lightly. He was not, as Darius has already mentioned, he was cheerful to talk to. He was fun outside court. He was a very easy person to get along with, and yet deeply loyal to his juniors. I mean, and he's had a fantastic stable. Darius is one of them. He went on to become not only the additional Solicitor General in Bombay, but also the Advocate General of Maharashtra. That's a great credit to Mickey. Many judges must have come out of his chamber, Riaz, his son, being one of them, and so on. So Mickey was a very well-rounded personality. And the important thing is that he wore his heritage also lightly. Mickey belonged to, in 1962, when Mickey joined Kharseji Bhaba's chamber, all eyes must have been on him because he was the son of what is probably early independent India's most well-known judge. And you take any lawyer of that generation and you ask them, who's your favorite judge? And this is true of Fali Nariman, Soli Sorabi, H.M. Sirvai, my father-in-law, V.M. Tarkunde. If you ask them who is your favorite judge, they will all say only one word, Chagla. I still remember sitting next to Fali one day over dinner, and he was in an expansive mood. And I said, Fali, who was the best counsel, who was the best advocate you ever saw? And he said, Nani. I said, who was the best judge? He straight away said, Chagla. So when Mickey came from that, heritage, he could have had a sense of entitlement. He could have had a sense of, but he never was. It was easy to get along with, very gracious to everybody. And nevertheless, as Darius, and we'll all tell you later, stood for all high principles. Later on, we'll tell you about the first judge's case, where he was the first petitioner in the whole of India, and that the case which is known as S.P. Gupta. So I'll allow Amit also now to.
Point well taken. Now, Maggie 2-minute noodles is known to a lot of kids and a lot of youth of India, introduced, I think, in the 80s, and generations have grown up eating Maggie. Senior Advocate Amit Desai appeared in that matter with Mr. Senior Advocate Iqbal Chagla, if I'm not wrong. If you could recount those times and how was your interaction in working with him on the matter and some other anecdote.
So, Tarun, let me sort of get back to something which I think at this point is, in my mind, more significant before I come back to the anecdotal statement on Maggie. But Darius has been in the chamber, and therefore Darius actually, as a family and a chambermate, has an inside and an outside view of Iqbal. I worked with Iqbal from an outside, another chamber, with him in several matters. But I think I'd like to contextualize Iqbal in today's context for all of us, because it's not today. I think it's not just about the memory of Iqbal Chagla, but I think in my mind, it is what Iqbal Chagla stood for. And I think that's relevant in the world in which we are living today, and the importance of a personality like him and what he represents for the generation that we have before us. And that's why I just spent a couple of minutes on the way I would kind of look at Mickey and what is the relevance of Mickey and his legacy for the generations to come. And for me, as in a sense, an outsider, we talk about this whole issue about work-life balance and work ethics, and we talk about how people should work and how many hours they should work. And exactly as Darius mentioned and Ryan mentioned, I think what you see in Mickey's life is that you see his success with what was a work-life balance. And you cannot underestimate that reality, that it is the roundedness of the gentleman on his knowledge of music, his passion for golf, his passion for the literature, and his success as a senior advocate in the country, which enabled him to maintain that success with the balance that he had in other areas of work. So I think in the context in which we are discussing, and I say this because this is relevant and topical today, that you could have a work-life balance where all these other what people may call recreational activities actually in many ways go to contribute to the success of the man in the courtroom. So it's not about that, but it's his ability to actually bring, in the context of the submissions that he makes, the arguments that he makes, the finesse, the elegance, as he understood literature, as he put it in context, is what we in many ways miss in today's fast-paced world that we are living in, where counsels, juniors, seniors want to work their brief out and walk out of court, and that's it. But when you look at the way in which we argued matters, the advocacy styles of those days, which in many ways I was fortunate when I joined the profession, and I was not in the chamber of any of these legends at that time, but I had the opportunity to work with the legends of that period, and I had the chance to work with Harshitji Cooper, Nani Palkewala, Parasaran, Venugopal. I mean, that whole Ashok Desai, Pali, Soli, and all. But the style of advocacy that we knew, and that's why, in some ways, when I commented, I said Mickey, in some ways, was. What Ryan says, the last of the Mohicans. I said he epitomized, what we believed and learned about what senior counselors about, what advocacy was about, how he presented, and the all-roundedness of him actually brought out all this. So I think in many ways for me, as I see it as an outsider, Mickey represents that generation. And I think it's about how the current generation should derive from that aspect of Mickey. And those are the learnings that I think he leaves behind for the generation today. So that is where I see Iqbal, and I think his contribution in many ways, apart from all the law, etc., and then what he leaves behind for this generation is people should recognize his personality and see what it can do for themselves in today's world. So I'm sorry. So that was my opening comment, which I would. And if you want me to continue right now, I'll come back to my experience with Maggie a few minutes later, because there is, in the same strain, I can tell you my personal experience about how we did with Maggie and some of the inner stories, which I think today I can probably share about Mickey in this very context in which you're talking about, just as an illustration of what he is, what he was, and what the profession should be. I mean, that's where. So if you want me to continue,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
Tell us.
So principles and values. That's one thing which we've all heard about Mickey. So when I was involved in that matter, when the brief first went to Mickey, he was not ready to take that brief willingly. His value systems first required him to be satisfied that here was a case involving food safety and health of children. Maggie was being consumed by children. Considering all the media publicity that went around it, he wanted to be careful and cautious that he was not representing a cause that affected food safety and health of children. So I still remember the early days when he wanted to be clear in his mind that what is this matter about, And did Nestle do anything inappropriate or wrong? It was only after he was fully satisfied that Nestle had done nothing wrong in that particular matter that he then said, all right, I will accept the brief. I mean, it talks about a different kind of level of, value system to say that here is a matter which may impact the health of children. And I don't want to get into it to run a cause, which even if I succeed, it reminds me a little bit of what Fali had his kind of a regret when he did Union Carbide. But Mickey actually checked it out before he agreed to accept the brief. And then, of course, is the court strategy and all, which maybe I'll build on that a little later. But this tells you about the man, how he looks at a matter, how he looks at a cause. And I think, like Ryan was mentioning, and he'll talk about it later, is the judge's case. So for him, it was important that I will take up a cause and fight it. But if I feel that in the routine commercial cases, you keep fighting. That's all right. But when there's a larger implication to society, he was very, very careful. I mean, that's a very different side of person, which you don't find daily in today's times. You can give up a brief, because Nestle was one of the most important cases at that time. But he said, "I'll give it up if I don't agree with the issue." Anyway, so this is one of those. But there are other interesting court-craft strategies which I'll share with you. Reyes and Ryan give a little bit of it.
Thank you for sharing these two anecdotal, stories which give us insight into what a man he was, and very interesting to know. And for a lot of youngsters, a lot of young lawyers too. I'll go to Mr. Darius Kambata for two anecdotes. You worked as a senior advocate him, but you also joined him. So you've seen him through and through all these years, since the 80s and maybe early. Could you share two anecdotes, one personal, one professional, about the man that was senior advocate Iqbal Chagla?
Let me think. I haven't thought which ones, but let me, in fact, take one straight from what Amit was saying about him. As I said, his adherence to principles was not just a public face. It was a very private, inward struggle, brief by brief, situation by situation. And sometimes he had to take stands which were personally embarrassing to him, but he took them because that was the right thing to do. I remember in one matter, he was a very enthusiastic counsel in public interest matters. He took a lot of public causes, but he always evaluated the cause. So he used to tell me that, when you accept a PIL, it's an added responsibility because you have to give it more attention than a paying matter. And obviously, you don't charge for it, but you also have to evaluate whether you're actually doing good to the public interest by advancing that cause. And I know one case in which we were together, and I think I can mention the name. Years ago, there was a PIL to challenge the Worli Bandra sea link, and we were for the petitioners to challenge it. And we produced all sorts of statistics and what would happen, etc. And at one point, both of us felt that I think, there's a limit to what we can argue here. And is it really serving the public cause to pursue this petition? Obviously, the PIL group was not going to withdraw the petition. So we did the next best thing, which is we returned our briefs, and I did it under the guidance and with the example of my senior. He said, I'm going to return my brief. I said, so do I. So he would actually do that. It was a cause célèbre at the time, but he didn't mind that. He gave it up because he didn't feel it was the correct thing to do. And of course, ultimately, that petition got dismissed. There's a judgment. But well before that, he had already assessed it. So it's in action what Amit is saying. About a personal anecdote, there's so many. He was very, as Ryan said, he was lighthearted. He wore his greatness very lightly. He didn't take himself seriously in chambers. So there was a lot of leg pulling. It was almost de rigueur to pull his leg. He hated words like sir and Mr. Chagla and all the obsequial stuff you sometimes hear today. There is no part of our chamber.
Mickey.
And you could say anything to him. You could pull his leg. You could say anything. He never took it. He didn't take slights. He was not so thin-skinned as to take slights. Ours was a very open chamber. There were juniors who spoke freely. He would disagree with you, you would disagree with him. There was no problem. Then sometimes he would have chamber dinners at his house, and his wife Roshan was a very gracious lady, a fantastic gourmet chef. She would cook. And joke with her all the time is that you always cook, you don't cook enough, your food always runs out. So, and we of course had Kharseji Baba, who was a doyen in his own right, and he was by that stage at the end of his career. So he joined in the fun, and every evening at 4:45, which is when at that point the court rose, the Bombay High Court rose, we would spend at least half an hour on a chamber tea. So we would have a snack or two and a cup of tea. And all of us, 8, 10 of us would sit together and just, there was a time not to talk about law, just to unwind a bit, and conferences would start after that half hour. So he inculcated a very nice atmosphere. And Amit is right. When you hear all this 90 hours a week and 70 hours a week, it's not the number of hours, it's the quality of work. In any field, I don't think it only applies to law. And it's not that lawyers don't work hard. It's not that Iqbal didn't work hard. He was thinking about matters, he was reading at home.
Yeah, true.
All of us do that. It's not the number of hours. In fact, that's a very sort of servient way of looking at it. You can't. You may produce fantastic work with 50 hours a week. So it's creating the right atmosphere, and I think that's what he did. And he made us committed to a cause and to a brief. So you really felt invested in it. He told us, never put your name to a pleading unless you're really confident and satisfied of it. So that's what we did. The other thing I learned from him, actually, one of the most important things I learned, was not a slavish adherence to case law. Today we have, this judgment, that judgment, the latest judgment of the Supreme Court, or this. That's not how he operated. He operated on sure legal principles, which he had learned when he was in England, in Cambridge, and they were common law principles. He really understood them. So if a judgment was brought up in conference, which might be on the point, but which was so extreme that couldn't be the basis of a sensible argument, he was loath to cite it. I mean, he might have cited it, but his heart was not in it. He preferred placing his argument on a surer foundation of legal principles. And I think he taught a lot of that to us, and we learned, I hope, a lot of that while we were witnessing him in action. So his foundations as a lawyer were extremely strong. I'll leave it now to Amit and Ryan to.
One extra comment, if you can share with us, because we got to know that he was fond of golf and other. Was he fond of food? Anything that you know on that? And what he like?
Of course, yeah.
Food of all categories. So it's not that he only like gourmet food. He was a gourmet. He knew his food. He knew his whiskies. I remember in the 70s, I've heard this story when you couldn't get foreign liquor that easily in India, and even Scotch was not easily available. Single malts were a rarity at that time, and someone sort of said, "Oh, you can't make out the difference between a good Indian whiskey and a Scotch. It's impossible." And he said, "No, I can." So they gave him a blind test.
And he was right, huh?
12 glasses before him, and he was right every time. So he had that. What he did well. He was a connoisseur. He loved his art. He loved his jazz, of course, golf. Almost fanatical. They would get up wee hours of the morning and go and play and things like that. So he lived life very well. And I truly believe that made him better as a lawyer.
That sentence says a lot. What he did well. I'll go to Mr. Ryan Karanjawala for his comment on Mr. Iqbal Chagla.
So I'll speak on two aspects. One is, of course, I'll take on from where Darius spoke. Darius was giving to you the atmosphere in their chamber. But what he didn't tell you was that chamber has a particular national anthem, which every time when they all get together, they sort of all jump in and sing. It's called "We Had Joy, We Had Fun, We Had Chamber Number One." And virtually at every dinner of theirs, somebody would break into song, and then everybody from Rohington onwards would be shouting and screaming.
Jimmy
Avasya would start it, and then they'd all be singing away. And Iqbal built up a brilliant atmosphere around himself. And in that happy atmosphere, he was also able to create some of the top councils of Bombay today, One of them is on our panel, Darius himself. The other is Janak Dwarkadas. They're right at the very top. Riaz has become a judge, and there's so many others who I wouldn't be straight off able to name, but they've all benefited from his sheer presence, his loyalty to his juniors, the way he nourished them, the way he promoted them, the way he looked after them. Side by side with all this light-hearted part of his personality, there was a deep conviction and the ability to fight for what he thought was proper. I'll give you one example. That was a matter in which I opposed him. It was called the Bombay Mill Lands case. Essentially, he appeared for the Bombay Environmental Action Group. And the basic point was, when the mill lands were being allowed to be converted from mill lands to commercial property, how much could the owner keep and how much did he have to surrender to the public at large for the greater good? Iqbal said that we had to surrender much more than we actually wanted to surrender. We won ultimately. But that was a case where I saw Iqbal's dedication. I appeared for that case. I'd gone down to the Bombay High Court. Throughout that, every hearing, Mickey was there. He left everything, came to the Supreme Court also when it was being argued. Throughout it, every hearing, he was there too. And that shows you his dedication to what he believed in. When, this was in, I think, 1981, 82, the first judge's case was argued. The case which is actually known as S.P. Gupta's case. When it was first argued, the actual petitioner who first went to court in the whole of India was Iqbal Chagla. He was represented at that time by the doyens of the profession, H.M. Sirvai, who argued and was the lead counsel in the Supreme Court. Along with him, Khatu Cooper, along with him, Avinash Rana, and the great solicitor Dango Gagrat himself, who was on record for them both in the Bombay High Court and then when the case was transferred to the Supreme Court. In fact, I remember this anecdotally, that in those days there used to be a series of, quick judgments which used to come, and there was something called Judgments Today. When Judgments Today first came out, it reported it as Iqbal Chagla's case. So he was actually the first petitioner in that particular matter, and he had to, and as Darius also pointed out, he had the courage as president of the Bombay Bar Association to take on the judiciary when he felt that they were in the wrong. So he was a very rounded personality, fun to be with, but not someone you could trifle with, not someone who would take advantage of, who would misuse the power of the law, someone who fought for his principles. So he's really, in a sense, a unique personality, and everybody over the years is going to miss him.
Point very well taken. I'll go to senior advocate Amit Desai for, I think, a few more interesting anecdotes that he just wanted to spell out, but now he's going to share.
So again, just going back to old values in the profession, and something that Ryan just mentioned, when Iqbal took up a brief, and particularly went to the cause, in the traditions of the bar at that time, he was there for every single hearing, no running around in courts. I think that was one thing about Iqbal. Today's world is again different, but he took a brief, was committed to the brief. He was there on every single day when the matter was going on. So he never said, okay, I'm coming back here, which is something that is fair. So that is again Iqbal. And then, just about his courtcraft, just an interesting sort of anecdote about his courtcraft and his way of presentation. So again, going back to this case which we fought together, the Maggie case. So we had a very tricky situation when the ban on Maggie came. Nestle had voluntarily withdrawn the product. So when we filed the petition, we were debating as to what is the interim relief that we can ask. We've already voluntarily withdrawn everything. So what is it that we can say? But there was one aspect of the matter which was, concerning us, which was Nestle had a very large export potential for its products. They had large exports, and so there were a lot of Maggie products lying for export. We were debating as to how to strategize it because of the nature of the matter, the public opinion that was against Maggie at that point of time. So how do you keep the business going and yet deal with this situation? So it was a very interesting sort of approach that we evolved and how Iqbal is very elegant advocacy. Iqbal was never in the face advocacy. He was subtle. He was, very, very, proper about his advocacy and the way he would argue. And in the whole process, we kept raising the issue about, the amount of Maggi noodles and food that was going to get destroyed in the country with this kind of a ban. And he kept emphasizing that aspect of the matter and provoked the state to say, in that case, why do we export the goods? Because the state wanted to be seen to be balanced. He said that you don't want destruction of food. So, okay, you want to export it, go and export it. So the export market was fine. And that's where Mickey picked up exactly what we wanted without an eye and said, that's exactly, if your lordship allow us the export and we can carry on the activity of export. And that actually changed the whole framework of the matter, because the court immediately then said, all right, we are allowing the activity of export. So Nestle could continue to export to the US, to UK, New Zealand, Australia, and many other countries. And what was interesting was in all those countries, they had a testing mechanism. In all those countries, they cleared the test. There was never a problem with it. So it created a huge kind of impact, favorable. But you just see how, his way he crafted that whole strategy, presented it, got the other side to then find the balance and say, okay, go ahead and export it because we don't want it in India. Because India has put the ban. So it was a very interesting courtcraft in the way he played it out. And I think the second thing, which is, I think, to Darius on the other side, because there were two counsels on the other side. There was, I think, the FSSA was being led by somebody else, and Darius who came in for the union, I thought.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
That's right. So at one point, there was an allegation that was made of suppression of a particular document, which Darius had instructions to make. And Iqbal, when he heard the argument coming from Darius, we got all back in the chamber and he just blasted everybody. He said, what is this? Because, coming from Darius, he took it very, very seriously. And we had to work overnight to find out everything about that one document, which was the important laboratory report, which was being used against us by the government. And they said, oh, you're suppressing the writ because you already had a copy of it. So Mickey was very, very particular about all these aspects of the matter. So overnight, fortunately, Nestle was able to find the document, find the speed post record, because those days we had a tracking system, and found out the day on which it was received. It was received after the writ was filed. So next day, when we were back in court, Iqbal, of course, promptly and properly pointed this out. And to Darius's credit, in the afternoon, he took fresh instructions and comes back and says, I withdraw my submission on suppression. I mean, those are the days and those are the ways in which the profession works. But you may not remember it, Darius.
But that's his training. That's his training.
How it was positioned, how Iqbal was so concerned. He got us to really work into it. And then when he came back, of course, with Darius's training in Iqbal's chamber, Darius said, I withdraw the submission because he confirmed it. But yeah, these are just little anecdotes of how the profession works and how we maintain ethical standards and principles and all, which is really, in many ways, the story of the day. But so these are some interesting sort of anecdotes that I had about Iqbal, apart from all this, something that we all need to emulate. I always, when made a comment earlier, he epitomized the senior bar, senior advocates.
That's true.
Really, he stood for something and he stands for something. And I think that's really, for us, a great takeaway.
Now we'll take, thank you for sharing that interesting insight into what man Senior Advocate Iqbal Chagla was. I take one last comment for Senior Advocate Darius Kambata, who started out his career with him. Anything that you would like to share from the then Bombay of 1984?
Lots actually, but as both my colleagues have said, it was in a sense a different world. And I'm not so sure that today's modern world is unequivocally an improvement on that world. There were certain systems, there were certain standards, there was a work ethic which we don't always find today. But that's a broader remark for another day. I always felt, I turned to Iqbal for a lot of advice throughout my career. And we used to have this, after I left his chambers physically and set up my own chambers, I would share lunch with him on Saturday afternoon. So I'd go across to his chambers and we'd have the same meal. It was dahi curry. And his wife would cook, and Roshan would constantly complain, saying, can't I send something else? And I said, no, I want exactly the same thing. So for all those years, we had the identical menu every Saturday. And then I became Advocate General. And our profession is a very hierarchical profession. The Advocate General does not go to any other lawyer's chambers and all that sort of thing. So the first day I became Advocate General, Iqbal came to meet me in the Advocate General's chambers because that was his way of adhering to tradition. But I decided that Saturdays was not a work day. And I wanted to keep up my Saturday lunch. So every Saturday I'd walk across from the AG's chambers and go to his chambers and share that lunch. I thought that was far too valuable for me to give up on some stupid notion of the Advocate General doesn't go to other lawyers' chambers. So that was of great value to me as well. And there was so much you could learn from him, and we hopefully did pick up some things along the way. It's the subject matter of a book, probably. There's so much to say, but his work ethic was also superb. He had meticulous preparation in conferences. He was not this flashy lawyer who'd just pick up one point and then sort of improvise on it in court. No. It was a very methodical way of making notes, very methodical conference. He'd look into documents, he'd be satisfied himself. And that, of course, is also great training. I hope that has not passed. I hope that there are lawyers today, and I know that there are who still adhere to that. But I think the key is that something a young lawyer still aspires to today? I think a lot of our young lawyers have stars in the eyes of what they think is good advocacy, namely that in a 5-minute conference, he was then able to argue for 2 hours. So that's not the right approach. The right approach should be, he took 2 hours to get ready, but he was able to encapsulate the core of his argument in 5 minutes. I think that's a better equation, frankly, that they should aspire to. And that was Iqbal.
Thank you for sharing such a insight into the man, and also a good anecdote. Indeed, it was a good show, part 1 of the life and times of senior advocate Iqbal Chagla. A lot of people reminisced on the old times. The Ras Kambata, of course, more personally because he worked with him. And of course, he shared so many, Senior Advocate Amit Desai, Mr. Ran Karanjawala. I thank each one of you for making time for Senior Advocate Iqbal Chagla, sharing what you thought of the man, sharing your personal anecdotes, and sharing memories. This is indeed a very valuable gem of an episode, which each one watching, I'm sure, will cherish it. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.